The final portion in the book of Bereshis is the portion or parsha of Vayechi. And after we conclude the portion in the Torah, in the synagogue, we all shout out together, Chazak, Chazak, v'nis chazek. Be strong, and be strengthened. In other words, by reading this parsha and concluding the book of Bereshis, this gives us additional strength, additional encouragement, and this gives us additional faith to be able to move on in our daily life. And so we need to look into the parsha to see what the parsha teaches us and what it tells us, and how to learn from the parsha how to enhance our daily life. The opening verse of the parsha is Vayechi Yaakov, and Yaakov lived Be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt. Sheva Esrei Shana, 17 years. Vayehi Yimei Yaakov Shnei Chayav Sheva Shonim Varboim Umi'ah Shana, and the life of Yaakov was 147 years. We know the Torah is exact in every word and every letter. If the Torah is telling us he lived 147 years, then we know he lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. Because in the previous parsha, the Torah told us Yaakov was 130 years when he came down to the land of Egypt. So why must the Torah tell us he lived 17 years in Egypt, and now 17 plus 130 equals 147? Either say he lived 147 years, and on our own we understand by subtracting the years of his life that he lived 17 years in Egypt, or simply say he lived 17 years in Egypt, and then we can conclude that he lived a life of 147 years. But why do we need both of these things? The fact that the Torah gives us both of these statements implies that each one is a lesson for us in our life. Number 2. The parsha here is called a parsha stuma. What does that mean? As we'll soon see in Rashi. In the Torah, in the written Torah, which is written by a scribe, there are no nekudos, there are no vowels, there are no periods, there are no question marks, there are no exclamation points, there are no titles to the new portion. All there is are letters and paragraphs. There are open paragraphs and closed paragraphs. A closed paragraph means it starts at the beginning of the line. An open paragraph means it starts in the middle of the line. But a new paragraph, by definition, means that there is a separation of an average of, let's say, 9 words, 9 letters, which is 3 words, between one portion and the next portion. Sometimes it's more than that. But one thing is for sure, between one parsha and the next, one portion of the Torah and the next, and there are 53 parshiyot, 53 portions in the Torah, there is always a separation by letters, empty letters, that allow us to know we are starting now a new paragraph. We are starting now a new portion. The only parsha, the only portion in the Torah that does not have this white space of empty letters between one parsha and the next parsha is the portion of Vayechi. It continues like a run-on sentence from the previous parsha into the new parsha. And this question is presented by Rashi. Rashi, the classic commentator of the Torah, says like this: Vayechi Yaakov, and Yaakov lived. Lama parsha zu sutuma. Why is this parsha closed? Says Rashi, 2 reasons. Number 1, lefi shekivan sheniftar Yaakov Avinu, because once Yaakov, our forefather, passed away, nistemu einehem v'libam shel Yisrael, the eyes and the hearts of Israel were closed. Mitzoras hashibur, because of the suffering of the enslavement. She'eschilu l'shabdam, for the Egyptians began to enslave them. So a closed parsha means that the eyes and the hearts were closed. Two questions. Number one, generally when we talk about pain and suffering, the pain and suffering is in the heart, not in the eyes. Rashi should have simply said that because Jacob died, now the hearts of Israel were closed because of the pain and suffering of the enslavement. Number two is, in reality, how many years after Yaakov died did the enslavement truly begin? Well, one thing's for sure, it did not begin until all of the tribes, which means all of his children, died. Now, Yosef died 54 years after Yaakov's death, and Levi was the last one to die, which was years later. So for many, many years, there was no enslavement. Why then, at the very beginning of the parsha, does Rashi tell us that the heart and the eyes of the Jewish people were closed because of the enslavement? It took place many years later. Rashi goes on to give another interpretation. Davar Acher, alternatively, Shebikish Legalis Zaketz. Yaakov Avinu wished to reveal the end of time, the coming of Mashiach, the building of the third holy temple, Levanav to his sons, V'nista mimenu, but it was closed off from him, as it says in the Medrash, the Bereshis Rabbah. So, these are two reasons of why the Parsha in the Sefer Torah, in the written Torah, in the Torah scroll that is written by hand, by a scribe, there is no separation between last Parsha and this week's Parsha. Now, the Medrash gives a third interpretation, which Rashi, for some reason, does not bring. And the third interpretation is, why is it a closed Parsha? To tell us that since Yaakov came to the land of Egypt, all of the tsaris, all of the problems of his life was closed. He started a new life. There was closure to Yaakov's life. And now he started a new life in Egypt. So all the pain and all the suffering and all the loss and all the tragedy and all the hardships and all the difficulties and all the disappointments and all the pitfalls and all the heartbreak was all closed. That was his past life. He came down to Egypt, he started all over again. And that is why it says he lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. Because 17 is the gematria of Tov. The word Tov, good, Tes is 9, Vav is 6, Beis is 2, equals 17. As the commentaries explain, the Torah is telling us that Yaakov's best years were in the land of Egypt. Now, how could that be? He wasn't in Israel, he was in exile, he was in the diaspora. How could it be the best years of his life? And the answer is because he sent Judah to establish a yeshiva there, to make sure that that place, even though it's outside of Israel, will have a Jewish community where they will study Torah, where they will pray. By doing so, these were the best years of Yaakov Avinu's life. And he lived 147 years as total, to tell us, as the other commentaries explain, that they were all good. They were all good. How can you say they were all good? All 147 years were good. He suffered most of his life, the first 130 years of his life. The majority of that was pain and suffering, war. Say the commentaries, the Alshich and others, to tell us that even though it was only 17 years of his life, but those 17 years were so great and so peaceful and so tranquil and so spiritual and so godly and so holy and so unified that retroactively it made all the other years of his life good. He forgot about the pain. He forgot about the suffering. It was all good. All that ends good is good. So he ended off on a high. He ended off positively. And he forgot about all the tsaris of the past. And that is the way it's going to be when Mashiach comes. That when Mashiach comes, we're going to have such a great life that we're going to forget all the pain and suffering of the golus, of the exile days. Now, the parsha is called Vayechi. Vayechi means, and he lived. And the question is, how can you call the parsha Vayechi, and he lived, when the entire parsha talks about his death, how he's preparing for his death? As we see in the very next verse, in verse 29, it says, Vayikrevu Yimei Israel-Hamas, and the days for the passing of Yisrael, which is Jacob, the time approached for him to pass away, for him to die. So, how do we call the parsha Vayechi? And furthermore, it's a closed parsha, implying the pain and suffering of the Jewish people. And the answer is, what is true life? What is true chayim? What is chayim amitim, true life? The only true life is God. As the prophet Jeremiah tells us, Hashem Elikim Emes, God, your Lord, is true. Hu Elikim Chayim, he is the living God. The only thing that lives forever and is eternal is God. And therefore, for us to be eternal, for us to live forever, we have to connect to God. We say this when the Torah scroll was taken out. And you today, by cleaving to God, you are alive. Yeah. What does it mean to cleave to God? It means to do a mitzvah. The word mitzvah means connection. It means to study Torah, which is God's intellect. Then our intellect wraps around the intellect of God. It's the greatest unity, says the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. The greatest unity in this world that can possibly take place between man and God is through the study of Torah. Because number one, your mind envelops God's holy wisdom, and then the wisdom envelops your mind. It's a double connection. There's no such thing in this world that can have this double lock, this double connection, like the connection between man and God through the study of Torah. However, this chayim, this life of godliness, this life of spirituality, that is true life, and that is eternal life, and this life brings us into the world to come. That's our ticket into heaven and into paradise. Because a good person who never hurt anybody all their life is not a bad person, but they're not a good person. To get into paradise, you need mitzvahs, you need good deeds, you need Torah study. That's your ticket into heaven. If not, you're in limbo. So, what is true life? True life is connecting with God. However, even that is not enough. Because the fact is, after a person passes away, there is this stopping, this is the ceasing of life. True life is without interruption. True life is without end, without a break, without a pause. And therefore the Talmud says, what is true life? Ma zari b'chayim af hu b'chayim. If your children are alive, and your children go in your ways, then you are alive, you live forever. Not only in the spiritual, but you also live in the physical. Now, those who don't have physical children can have children through students. Students are your children. Or by giving a Jewish child the Jewish education. That becomes your child. Or teaching and mentoring a child. That becomes your child. So there are many ways to have children. Furthermore, your good deeds are your children. It says the children of tzaddikim and the offsprings of tzaddikim really are your good deeds. So there are many ways to have these children. And therefore, by doing so, by doing good deeds in this physical world, and by having literal, biological children in this physical world who go in your ways, this is the way you live on forever. However, it's not that easy. Because that is true, perhaps, when you live in a perfect world, when you live in the land of Israel, when everything is, as they say in America, hunky-dory. But when things are not so perfect, when there's a time of war, when it's difficult and challenging to live your life as a Jew, when you're not living in the land of Israel, when you're living in the diaspora, and when you're going through a time of war and chaos and corruption and communism and Germany and Nazism, etc., etc., and when you have to hide in caves, and when you have to hide in bomb shelters, then the question is, do I still have to be Jewish? Do I still have to have that Jewish pride? Do I still continue to study Torah and do mitzvahs? And the answer is yes. This is the meaning of the parsha of Vayechi. The parsha of Vayechi, Yaakov lived, we're in Egypt, outside of the land of Israel, at a time of challenge, a time of difficulty, at a time of hardship. When a person is able to sustain all of these challenges, that is true life. True life is not when you live in the Bahamas and you're relaxing and smoking a cigar. That's not real life. Real life is when you go through the challenges of life, and yet you're able to maintain your identity. You're able to maintain your Jewish pride. You're able to maintain your Torah study and your mitzvahs. Even because of the chaos and challenges and hardships and disappointments of the world, then Vayechi, you live on forever. That is true life. And that is the message of the parsha. Vayechi Yaakov, we are Be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt. The word Mitzrayim, Egypt, is etymologically the word tsuris, problems, tsuris. And it also means limitations, borders and constraints. So when you live in this state of reality, but yet in your state of mind, you are beyond, you are able to overpower and overcome these challenges. As the previous Rebbe said, only the body of a Jew goes into exile, but the soul of a Jew is never exiled. We have the power to rise above all the challenges with our mind, with our mind's eye. Then we are not in a state of golus. And then you have Vayechi, you have eternal life. Now this brings us to the next question. We said earlier that Rashi tells us that why is the parsha closed? Why is the portion closed? Because the eyes and the hearts of the Jewish people became closed because of the tsuris, the hardships and the pain of the bondage. But the bondage did not start yet. It started many years later. And Rashi answers this question by saying it's the eyes that were closed, and then the heart was closed. In other words, when we see something with our mind's eye and we perceive it, even in reality, it's not there yet. It causes us anxiety. And this is exactly what Rashi is telling us here. It's a very psychological Rashi. Depending on what your eye sees and what your mind's eye sees, that's the way your heart reacts. As the Talmud says, your eye sees and your heart desires. And the same is true in the negative. You see a good piece of brownie, a good piece of ice cream, a good piece of steak. You see it sizzling. I see it with my eyes, my heart desires it. Okay, but it's true also when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to war. The fact that Yaakov Avinu died already changed their perspective. They said, look, when Yaakov came down, there were two miracles that took place. Number one is the hunger stopped. Even though originally in the dream of Pharaoh there were 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. When Yaakov came down to Egypt, it was the second year of the famine. After 2 years of famine, the famine ceased. A miracle took place, and everybody knew this was in the merit of Jacob. The entire Egypt knew this. And therefore, when Jacob walked around Egypt, they bowed down to him. They praised him. They thanked him. And you can imagine if the father gets all the blessings and gets all the honor, the children get blessings and honor too. Oh, your father, because of him, the entire Egypt, thank God, has plenty of food today. Number two, there was a miracle that took place. And that is when Yaakov came down to Egypt. We know that there's no rain in Egypt, and the land gets irrigated from the Nile. In those days, it was not yet polluted, and the Nile produced all the water for the land of Egypt, but you had to go and schlep buckets of water from the Nile. However, a miracle took place. Yaakov blessed Pharaoh. When he walked over to the Nile would rise. And because the Nile would rise, it would then irrigate the entire land of Egypt. So they owed Jacob for these two things. Number one, for the fact that the hunger, the famine stopped. And number two, that the entire land of Egypt was irrigated because of his blessing. When he passed away, the blessing stopped. So now already the Egyptians are talking. Who are the Jews? Why are they here? Why do we need them here? Already they're talking. And the Jews see this with their eyes, what's going on. So even though the actual bondage did not start yet, but already they feel it's not the same. And similarly, this started really with Joseph. Because when Jacob was alive, Joseph, who was in the main capital of Egypt, used to invite his brothers that were in Goshen to come and participate at his table. When Jacob passed away, Joseph stopped inviting his brothers. Now the brothers thought that perhaps Joseph now will take revenge upon them. While Jacob was alive, he was afraid to hurt us. But now that Jacob is dead, now he's going to take revenge. And therefore, at the end of the parasha, Joseph has to reassure them that I will not, God forbid. God is the one that brought me here, not you. God brought me here to bring food and sustenance to the entire world and to save the entire world. But it wasn't you that made it happen. It was all through God. Now, let's take it on a deeper level. What does it mean that Joseph and his brothers were eating together? And what does it mean they were not eating together? So, in the Chassidus, we are taught that the path of Joseph was very different than the path of his brothers. We know the path of the brothers of Joseph were like the forefathers, and that is that they were shepherds. Why were they shepherds? So Chassidus explains the reason why they were shepherds is because of the fact that when you go out into the field, and now your sheep are grazing, you're able to sit and meditate and contemplate the greatness of the universe, of God, God's reality, God's manifestation, the unity of all the cosmos, the unity of godliness, and all the higher realms. The Baal Shem Tov was a shepherd for numerous years. Moshe Rabbeinu was a shepherd. All of the great leaders of Israel were shepherds because it was a time of transformation, a time of introspection, it was a time of meditation and isolation. It was the perfect job for any great spiritual leader. And even when they came down to Egypt, the reason why the brothers were put into Goshen was because of the fact that Pharaoh wanted to isolate them from the rest of the nation, because in Egypt, sheep were gods. And therefore, they were not supposed to be used for commercial purposes. So therefore, Yosef put them in Goshen, even though Goshen was the nicest land of Egypt. It had the most grass, most greenery. But at the same time, they were living alone, independently of the rest of the land of Egypt. When they came down to Egypt, Joseph brought them to their table, because Joseph lived in the everyday world. He was not like his brothers, because Joseph became the viceroy of Egypt. Egypt at that time was the most promiscuous of all lands. And Joseph, even though he was in the land of Egypt, with all these temptations, with all these desires, with all these opportunities, yet he maintained his righteousness. He was called Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef the Righteous, which is the reason why when the brothers first came down to Egypt, it says they did not recognize Joseph. The simple interpretation is that Joseph had a beard at that time. And when he left, he was 17, he had no beard, so they didn't recognize him. That's what the Rashi says. So he recognized them because they were older, so they had beards, they looked exactly alike. Maybe the beard turned white, but it was the same face. Joseph had no beard when he left the land of Canaan, of Israel. When he went down into Egypt, now he grew a beard many years later. So they didn't recognize him. According to Chassidus, Alter Rebbe says, they couldn't recognize Yosef because they said it's impossible that there should be a person living in Egypt and that should be so holy. It's impossible. It cannot be. They could not comprehend such a lifestyle. The only way you can be holy is remaining aloof or isolated from the everyday world. You cannot be part of the everyday world. That was the challenge. And that is why Joseph was considered to be greater than all his brothers. Because he was able to, on one hand, be a frum yid, a godly person, to daven every day, study Torah. As we know, the forefathers studied Torah. They knew the whole Torah before it was given. And they prayed, etc., etc. Abraham established the morning prayer, Yitzchak the afternoon prayer, Yaakov the evening prayer. So Yosef is praying 3 times a day. He's learning Torah every day. He knew his Torah. He didn't forget his Torah, which we said earlier in last week's parsha, when he sent the agolos, the wagons, was to hint to Jacob. I still remember the concept of the egla rufa, which is the decapitated calf that we studied before we left. So Yosef maintained his Torah study, and he maintained his righteousness and his holiness, etc., etc. And this again is implied with the famous story of him and Potiphar, his wife, that he controlled himself, and he did not violate that pact, that marriage, etc., etc. So the brothers could not understand how you could live such a lifestyle in the land of Egypt. When they came down to Egypt, Joseph brought them onto the table. Metaphorically, this means that they now were able to become one with Joseph and live that lifestyle as well. To be in the land of Egypt and to maintain their spirituality, which is really the interface between before the giving of the Torah and after the giving of the Torah. Before the giving of the Torah, primarily you were spiritual if you isolated yourself from the world. The giving of the Torah on Sinai now changed the paradigm that now we have to be part of the world and yet at the same time overcome those challenges, which is a greater challenge than simply remaining aloof and separated and isolated from the rest of the world. So what happened was, after Jacob's death, once again now they returned to their old lifestyle. They became once again these shepherds. They forgot that the purpose of Torah is not to remain within the spiritual, but it has to impact the physical. And not only the physical and your everyday life and your business life, but the Torah also needs to impact the nations of the world, which is why Jacob, when he came down to Egypt, he taught Pharaoh and the citizens of Egypt the 7 Noahide laws. And this is hinted by the fact that Jacob says, when I die, take me out of the land of Egypt. Why? So they shall not make me into an idol. One of the 7 Noahide laws is the prohibition of idolatry. Jacob taught them against that prohibition, and he was afraid if he would stay there, they would make him into a saint, and more than that, into an idol, and begin to serve him. So all of this brings us back to Vayechi. Vayechi, what does it mean to live? To live does not simply mean to be able to stand up in the morning and be vertical and walk on 2 feet instead of 4 feet. That does not distinguish us from the animals of the world. What distinguishes us from the rest of the world and from those that walk on 4 legs is the fact that we have a purpose and we have a mission. And that is Vayechi, to live. To live how? As Yaakov lived. Vayechi Yaakov. Yaakov represents the study of Torah. And therefore, by the fact that we study Torah every day of our life, even though we find ourselves now in the diaspora, the last few seconds before the coming of Mashiach, the way we can have peace and tranquility in our life is following the path of Yaakov, which is the path of Torah. Studying Torah, living Torah, this will give us peace. And if you don't have peace, it means you need to study a little more Torah. And if you don't have true happiness, it means you got to do a little more mitzvahs. That is the way we're going to bring ourselves to this state of Yaakov, to the state of tranquility. And that is chazak v'nis chazik. And that is the strength that the Torah is giving us. And that is the strength that the Torah is reminding us of. And that is the strength that the Torah is encouraging us with. And that is by the fact that we live the path of Yaakov. Torah promises us and Torah guarantees us that this will bring you into a state of peace. This will bring you into a state of tranquility. This will bring you into a state of happiness and fulfillment. And we hope and pray very, very soon. As the Medrash says, that when Yaakov came down to Egypt, there is a closed parsha because it's a time of closure. It's a time that all the pain and suffering stopped. So this is a blessing in this week's parasha, that we in our personal life, any pain and any suffering and any disappointment that we have now, says the Torah, Vayechi, it's a time to start living. It's a time to close all of that pain, to get rid of all of that discomfort and suffering. And God promises us, and God gives us the tools of how to do this. So we hope and pray to see the ultimate Vayechi. The ultimate Vayechi is that true eternal life. Not only that we live through our children. As it says, when Mashiach will come, there will be the resurrection of the dead. For those who lie in the dust will rise and sing with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our day.